Hey, warrior! There comes a moment in every human life when the noise quiets just enough for truth to speak. It usually doesn't arrive dramatically. No explosion, no collapse. Just a still moment where you look at your reflection and sense something deeply unsettling. You haven't been growing. You haven't been building. You've been moving, staying busy, filling days, but somehow your life feels thinner than it should. Days slide into weeks. Weeks dissolve into months, and suddenly years have passed, leaving behind a quiet, heavy realization that time didn't disappear. It was surrendered, not stolen, not taken by circumstances, given away willingly, hour by hour, choice by choice. The ancient Stoics warned us about this exact danger long before distractions had names or screens. Seneca captured it with brutal precision when he wrote that we live as if we are mortal in our fears, but immortal in our desires. We panic over small discomforts, awkward conversations, physical effort, mental strain, yet we behave as if our biggest dreams can always wait until later. We fear the friction of today, but trust recklessly in endless tomorrows. This contradiction is where potential quietly dies, not through catastrophe, but through delay. Through the habit of telling ourselves we will begin soon, once conditions are perfect, once we feel ready, once life calms down. But life never calms down, it only moves forward. And while we micromanage minor anxieties, we procrastinate on the very actions that could change who we become. Stoicism does not accuse the world for this loss. It turns the mirror inward. Time is not stolen from us by other people, by systems, or by bad luck. It is handed over willingly in small, forgettable decisions. Another scroll, another episode, another excuse, another day of preparation instead of participation. Seneca understood human psychology so well because he watched people delay their lives while convincing themselves they were being reasonable. He observed that most people do not actually live. They merely postpone living, always planning, always getting ready, forever standing at the edge of beginning. This is not a laziness problem, it is a delay problem. Laziness is obvious and often temporary. Delay is seductive. Delay whispers promises. Tomorrow, you will take your health seriously. Tomorrow, you will start building something meaningful. Tomorrow, you will speak honestly. Tomorrow, you will become disciplined. But tomorrow is the most dangerous word in the human language because it offers comfort without cost and hope without action. And while tomorrow keeps promising, life keeps advancing. This is why so many people reach the end carrying a strange, unplaceable grief. Not for what they lost, but for what they never expressed. The music that never left them, the strength they never demanded of themselves. The life they sensed was possible but never fully claimed. The Stoics refused to live this way. They rejected the fantasy of spontaneous transformation and replaced it with urgency grounded in presence. Not panic, not anxiety, but a sober awareness that life is happening now and character is built only in the present moment. Marcus Aurelius, a man with more power than anyone alive at the time, reminded himself each morning that his duty was not to rule, not to impress, not to accumulate, but to do the work of a human being, to grow, to act with intention, to become worthy of his own potential. That is the question standing quietly in front of you right now. Not what you want someday, not who you admire, but whether you are willing to stop drifting and begin building while time is still yours. Most people have unconsciously accepted stagnation. They repeat routines without purpose, consume without intention, and confuse existence with living. But this message is not for them. It is for the ones who feel that quiet, uncomfortable tension inside. The anger that isn't destructive but clarifying. The inner voice that says, I was meant for more than this half-lived life. If that voice is still alive in you, then this moment matters. Because if you continue trusting in endless tomorrows, blaming circumstances for choices, waiting for motivation or permission that will never arrive, the cost will not be immediate. It will be regret. And the Stoics knew this truth with painful clarity. Regret is the heaviest burden a soul can carry because it cannot be undone. Epictetus once asked a question that cuts through every excuse. How long are you going to wait before you demand the best of yourself? Answer that honestly, not emotionally, not optimistically. Honestly, haven't you waited long enough? From this point forward, the Stoic path begins with urgency, without panic, with presence, without comfort, with the decision to stop negotiating with time and start honoring it through action. This is not motivation, this is a wake-up call, and it is only the beginning. If there is one enemy that quietly destroys more human potential than failure, rejection, or bad luck, it is negotiation with weakness. Not the obvious kind of laziness that looks like doing nothing, but the subtle, intelligent laziness that disguises itself as reasoning, patience, or self-care. This is the internal debate that happens every day between who you are now and who you know you could become. It sounds reasonable, it feels justified, and it ruins lives slowly enough that most people never notice until years have passed. The Stoics understood this danger with brutal clarity. They knew that every time you negotiate with resistance, you teach your mind that comfort has authority over commitment. Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, not to impress others, but to discipline his own character. When he struggled to rise from bed, he reminded himself that he was rising to the work of a human being, not a king, not a hero, a human being, because he understood something most people avoid. Discipline is not heroic, it is ordinary, and greatness is built by ordinary discipline repeated daily. The most powerful man in the ancient world still felt the same resistance you feel, the desire for ease, the temptation to delay, the urge to avoid discomfort. The difference was not that he felt less resistance. The difference was that he refused to debate it. Every internal negotiation weakens you. 5 more minutes becomes a habit. Tomorrow becomes a lifestyle. Soon, you are not someone who lacks ability, but someone who lacks self-trust. Each time you promise yourself action and deliver comfort instead, something erodes quietly inside. You begin to see yourself as unreliable, not to others, but to yourself. And when you lose trust in your own word, ambition becomes fantasy instead of a plan. Stoicism teaches that discipline is not punishment, it is honor. It is the quiet dignity of doing what you said you would do, even when no one is watching and nothing feels inspiring. Laziness operates on multiple levels. Physical laziness avoids effort. Mental laziness substitutes thinking for doing. Emotional laziness avoids difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. Spiritual laziness avoids examining whether your life actually aligns with your values. Each layer reinforces the others. And each time you choose ease over effort, the habit strengthens. But the opposite is also true. Discipline compounds. The Stoics practiced voluntary discomfort not because they enjoyed hardship, but because they understood preparation. They trained discomfort when life was calm, so they would not collapse when life became harsh. They woke early, worked deliberately, ate simply, and acted with restraint, not to suffer, but to remain free. Because the person who cannot say no to comfort will eventually be owned by circumstances. Ask yourself what laziness has already cost you. Not dramatically, quietly, time you cannot recover. Opportunities taken by others with less talent, but more consistency. Confidence drained by broken promises to yourself. Dreams not shattered, but slowly starved. While you negotiate with resistance, life does not pause. The skill you wanted to develop is being mastered by someone else. The business you imagined is being built by someone else. The strength you delayed is being forged by someone else. Stoicism demands mastery of the self before life forces submission to conditions beyond your control. And here is the hard truth. You do not defeat laziness when you feel motivated. Motivation is unreliable and temporary. You defeat laziness in moments like this, when you decide that negotiation is no longer allowed. expect resistance. It will always appear. Even in the best of people, what matters is your response. Build systems that function regardless of mood. Reduce temptations instead of testing willpower. Make discipline automatic. Lay out your tools before effort is required. Shape your environment so the right action is easier than the wrong one. And learn to reframe discomfort. The discomfort of effort is not a warning. It is proof. Proof that you are strengthening something inside that comfort cannot build. When you stop negotiating with laziness, you do not become harsh or rigid. You become trustworthy to yourself. You become someone whose actions align with intention. From this moment forward, draw a line. The version of you that bargains with weakness no longer leads. You rise when the alarm rings. You act when commitment calls. You move even when energy is low. Because discipline does not ask how you feel. It asks who you are becoming. And the life you want will only be built by the person who shows up without negotiation. If laziness keeps you stuck in place, lack of clarity keeps you moving in circles. Many people mistake movement for progress. They fill their days with activity, conversations, consumption, and obligations, yet feel strangely exhausted and unfulfilled. Not because they are doing too much, but because they are doing too much of what does not matter. The Stoics recognize this condition as one of the most dangerous forms of self-betrayal. A life lived without clear direction is not neutral. It is slowly wasted. Seneca warned that when a person does not know which port they are sailing toward, no wind is favorable. This is not poetic exaggeration. It is a psychological law. Without clarity, effort becomes scattered. Opportunities become distractions. Even success can become meaningless because it was never chosen consciously. Most people wake up reacting instead of deciding. They answer messages, respond to demands, chase urgency, and mistake busyness for purpose. They say yes out of habit, fear, or politeness, and no out of discomfort or uncertainty. Over time, this reactive way of living creates resentment, confusion, and a quiet sense that life is happening to them rather than being built by them. Stoicism demands something far more difficult than motivation. It demands decision, clear, uncompromising decision about who you are becoming and what you are willing to sacrifice to get there. Clarity is not about dreaming. It is about defining. It forces you to confront questions most people avoid because vague answers feel safer. What kind of person are you actually committed to becoming in the next 5 years? Not ideally, not hypothetically, but realistically, through daily action. What skills will you master? What standards will you live by? What behaviors will you no longer tolerate in yourself? What distractions will you eliminate, even if they are socially acceptable? Many people say they want success, happiness, or freedom, but these words mean nothing without precision. Vague goals produce vague lives. Precision creates power. Marcus Aurelius did not write his private reflections to sound wise. He wrote to force clarity on himself under immense pressure. He understood that without clear values, power corrupts focus, and comfort erodes discipline. Clarity begins in solitude, not noise. You cannot discover your direction while constantly absorbing other people's opinions, expectations, and emergencies. You must step back from the chaos long enough to hear your own thinking, and when you do, you must be honest. Clarity requires trade-offs. If you want to build something meaningful, you must also decide what you are willing to give up. Certain relationships, certain habits, certain comforts. You cannot drift toward excellence. You must walk away from mediocrity intentionally. Once clarity is established, life becomes simpler, though not easier. Decisions become cleaner. You stop asking whether something feels good and start asking whether it aligns. Does this move me closer to the person I am building or further away? Does this activity strengthen my character or weaken it? Does this relationship support growth or reward stagnation? When your direction is clear, you stop negotiating with distractions. You say no without guilt. You stop chasing every opportunity and start protecting your focus. You understand that time is not just limited, it is sacred. This is why the Stoics practiced regular reflection on mortality, not to become morbid, but to sharpen clarity. When you remember that life can end at any moment, confusion becomes unacceptable. Wasting time becomes intolerable. Living without intention becomes a form of disrespect to existence itself. Clarity is not something you find once and keep forever. It must be protected. The world will constantly attempt to pull you back into noise, urgency, comparison, and distraction. Your clarity must become your compass. When others are confused, reactive, and scattered, you remain grounded because you have decided what matters. And when you decide what matters, action begins to organize itself naturally. You no longer need constant motivation. Direction creates momentum. This is the turning point where drifting ends and building begins. Once clarity is established, most people make a fatal mistake. They wait. They wait to feel motivated. They wait to feel confident. They wait to feel ready. And while they wait, nothing changes. The Stoics would consider this not a lack of desire, but a misunderstanding of how human beings actually change. Motivation is not the engine of transformation. It is the byproduct of movement. Those who build meaningful lives do not act because they feel inspired. They feel inspired because they act. Modern culture romanticizes motivation as if it were a personality trait that some people are born with and others are denied. The Stoics rejected this illusion entirely. They understood that emotions are unstable, shaped by sleep, stress, health, weather, and countless forces beyond our control. To base your life on how you feel is to hand control of your destiny to randomness. Stoic discipline begins with a simple reversal. You do not wait for emotion to authorize action. You act, and emotion is forced to follow. Courage is not felt first and then expressed. It is expressed until it becomes felt. Discipline is not something you wait to feel ready for. It is practiced until readiness becomes irrelevant. This is why Stoic philosophy places behavior above inner dialogue. Action trains the mind, not the other way around. When people say they lack motivation, what they actually lack is momentum. Momentum is created through small, consistent actions taken regardless of mood. Clean actions repeated daily reshape identity. You begin to see yourself not as someone who intends to change, but as someone who does what must be done. This identity shift is more powerful than any burst of inspiration. The Stoics understood leverage. When the task feels heavy, you do not quit. You reduce the friction. You wedge another stone underneath and continue. Instead of waiting for perfect conditions, you design systems that operate even on your worst days. 10 minutes of movement instead of an ideal workout. 1 page of reading instead of a perfect study session. 1 honest action instead of a dramatic overhaul. These minimums are not weaknesses, they are anchors. They keep you moving when emotions collapse. Most people fail not because their goals are too big, but because their expectations of how they should feel while pursuing them are unrealistic. They assume growth should feel exciting. In reality, growth often feels tedious, uncomfortable, and slow. The Stoics accepted this without resentment. They built anyway. Momentum works quietly. You may not feel different after 1 disciplined day, but after 30, something shifts. After 90, your self-image changes. After a year, others begin calling your discipline talent. What they do not see are the days you acted without desire, without praise, without certainty. Momentum does not require belief. It creates belief. When you act consistently, even while uninspired, your nervous system learns that action is not dangerous. Resistance weakens. Doubt loses its voice. This is why Stoicism emphasizes steadiness over intensity. Anyone can act when emotions align. Few can act when they do not. That is the dividing line. The Stoic builder does not ask, "Do I feel like it?" They ask, "Is this aligned with who I decided to become?" And if the answer is yes, action follows automatically. This is how momentum replaces motivation. This is how lives are built quietly, daily, without drama. You move forward not because you feel powerful, but because you refuse to stop. And over time, power becomes who you are. At this stage, many people believe the hardest work is already done. They have awareness, they have clarity, they have momentum, and yet, without realizing it, they slowly slide back into old patterns. Not because they are weak, but because they underestimate the power of environment. The Stoics understood something modern culture often ignores. You do not rise or fall only by willpower. You rise or fall to the level of the environment you repeatedly place yourself in, your surroundings, your habits, and most importantly, the people you allow close to you quietly shape who you become. There is no neutral ground. Every environment is either reinforcing growth or normalizing stagnation. Look honestly at the people you spend the most time with. Not what they say they want, but how they live. Do they build, or do they talk about building? Do they act, or do they explain why action is difficult? Do they challenge your standards, or do they make excuses feel reasonable? Epictetus warned that associating too closely with those who avoid discipline slowly pulls you down to their level, not through malice, but through normalization. Mediocrity spreads quietly. It becomes comfortable. It begins to feel justified. Soon, standards lower without conscious decision. Excuses sound intelligent. Quitting feels mature, and ambition starts to feel naive. This is why Stoicism demands ruthless selectivity, not arrogance, not cruelty, clarity. You must choose builders over dreamers. Builders do not talk endlessly about potential. They convert intention into action. They do not need constant validation. They do not complain about discomfort. They accept it as part of the process. Being around such people raises your standards automatically. Their discipline makes your excuses uncomfortable. Their consistency reminds you of what is possible. And if you do not yet have builders around you, Stoicism offers a hard but liberating truth. Temporary solitude is far better than permanent stagnation. Growth often requires distance before it attracts alignment. At the same time, environment is not only people, it is what you consume. Most modern consumption is not designed to educate, strengthen, or evolve you. It is designed to distract, numb, and keep you passive. Endless scrolling, constant entertainment, emotional eating, and information overload do not relax you. They dull you. Seneca warned that a mind flooded with excess becomes weak, not fulfilled. What you give your attention to is what you become. If you constantly consume chaos, drama, and shallow stimulation, your inner world will mirror it. Stoic living does not reject pleasure. It rejects unconscious consumption. Rest is earned through effort. Entertainment is chosen deliberately, not reflexively. Learning replaces escape. Growth replaces numbness. When you shift from consuming to evolve instead of consuming to avoid, time expands. Energy returns. Capability compounds. 30 minutes of intentional learning daily can reshape an entire future. But knowledge alone is not enough. The Stoics insisted that wisdom must be applied. Read, then act. Learn, then practice. Reflect, then adjust. Information without execution becomes another form of procrastination. This is the moment where many lives diverge permanently. One path leads back to comfort, distraction, and familiar company. The other leads forward into discipline, selective solitude, and deliberate environments. One feels easier in the short term. The other feels meaningful in the long term. You do not need everyone to understand your path. You do not need approval to outgrow old habits. Your life is not a democracy. It is a responsibility. When your environment aligns with your values, growth accelerates naturally. When it does not, even the strongest intentions eventually collapse. Choose carefully. You are becoming something every day, whether you admit it or not. At the end of every life, There is a moment of reckoning that no success, distraction, or explanation can escape. Not a public judgment, not a comparison with others, just a quiet internal accounting. Did I live deliberately, or did I drift? Did I demand the best of myself, or did I negotiate it away? The Stoics understood that fear of failure is natural, but fear of regret is rational. Failure is temporary. It teaches, it hardens, it redirects. Regret is permanent. It offers no instruction, no growth, no redemption. It only asks the same question again and again. Why didn't you act when you could? This is why Stoic builders operate with a mindset that appears extreme to the comfortable world. They act as if giving up is not an option, not because success is guaranteed, but because surrender is unacceptable. Seneca warned that life is not short by nature, but made short by waste. And nothing wastes life faster than postponing what matters most. Most people approach their goals with casual commitment. They try, they hope, they leave psychological escape routes open so they can retreat when discomfort arrives. But the Stoic path demands total commitment. When something aligns with your values, you burn the bridge back to mediocrity. You remove the option of permanent quitting. This forces adaptation. It forces resilience. It forces growth. When retreat is no longer available, the mind becomes resourceful. Obstacles stop being reasons to stop and start becoming material to work with. Marcus Aurelius captured this perfectly when he wrote that the obstacle becomes the way, not metaphorically, practically. Every setback refines strategy. Every failure educates character. Every difficulty strengthens capacity. The Stoic does not collapse when plans fail. They recalibrate without losing direction. They understand that pain is unavoidable, but suffering is a choice. You will suffer either way. From the discipline required to build something meaningful, or from the regret of knowing you never truly tried. Only one of those pains leads somewhere worth going. When your life nears its end, may you be able to say with complete honesty that you did not hide from your potential, that you did not wait for permission, that you acted while fear was present, that you chose growth over comfort, discipline over distraction, and courage over convenience. Even if every goal was not fully achieved, you will have succeeded in the only way that truly matters. You will have lived fully. The Stoics never asked for an easy life. They asked for strength equal to reality. They did not beg for comfort. They trained for responsibility. They did not drift. They built. Your future does not need more promises or motivation. It needs action. The principles you have encountered are not inspiration. They are tools. Use them daily. Build your life deliberately, brick by brick, decision by decision. Time is moving, whether you act or not. So act, stand upright, breathe deeply, and choose to build while there is still time.